Okay, and there we are. Okay, we've got web dev, accounts payable, Scrum Master, project manager, awesome, app developer in training. It's amazing. Tester, full stack dev. Awesome, looks like we've got a pretty healthy mix. Junior tester. That's wonderful. Okay, so a little about me. I already told you about the SDET thing. SDET is short for Software Development Engineer and Test. The difference between developer and SDET, I'll go into a little bit more. I currently live in East Texas, in Longview, Texas, about 2.5 hours east of Dallas, also known as middle of nowhere. I currently have 3 cats, 2 dogs, and 12 chickens, maybe more depending if my hen's going to give me chicks. I speak French fluently and I love learning languages, whether applicable in speaking on code. I'm a fiction writer, textile artist, I do knitting, crocheting, sewing, and I love libraries. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is the pathway into QA and my personal journey with that. Kind of went all over the place for a while. Definitely did not have a traditional path where, went to school for a particular thing and then exited a job, got to do that thing like a lot of us. So at 15 years old, I left my hometown in upstate New York and moved to New York City in pursuit of becoming a professional ballet dancer at Joffrey Ballet School. And along the way, figured out that wasn't exactly what I wanted. I did have some professional gigs here and there, but not enough to really say that I was a professional ballet dancer. But at some point I decided, I want a house one day. And I had other goals that would require me to work a little bit more technically. So I didn't really know how to get there, but I grabbed almost everything along the way that I could to build up my resume, starting working at 16, 17. So abbreviating that, it pretty much went, working at Potbelly and then any retail gig I could get, working that for a couple of months and then moving on to the next thing because I hated it. And then that segued into sales, customer service, more sales, and eventually I moved from New York City to Chicago, where a lot of that pretty much developed. I was doing customer success for some tech startups. One was called Snapsheet, which I was there for about 2 years. Spot Hero, another tech startup that people are pretty familiar with, at least in the Midwest and New York City, major cities. So I was getting a little bit closer to what I wanted to do in terms of moving closer to tech. But every time I would try to apply for a more technical position, they'd be like, stay in your lane. And I didn't like that. So eventually I moved to Texas in terms of it was for a lifestyle change. I knew I wanted to save money again with the whole house thing. And eventually I went back and got my GED. So with my dance career, I did put my education on hold, but I think it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because it led me to where I am right now. Because with that GED program, one day my academic advisor heard me complaining about the app that the program was using for the students and teachers to facilitate and talk amongst themselves. And she called me into an app feedback session where the company that made the app for the program was going to be present and I could give my feedback. I didn't have anything to do. I wasn't employed at the time. So I thought, why not? And me not being able to halfway do anything, I made the PowerPoint. And I went pretty much screen by screen about what I personally would change if it were my app. and what features would be better, which could be improved, and which shouldn't be there altogether. And at a certain point amongst me sharing this information with them, they all started typing, and I thought they were ignoring me at first. And I stopped talking, and they all looked up from their computers and were like, no, keep going. You're doing good. I'm like, oh, okay. And at the end of that, pretty much they offered me a job at that company, and I thought they were crazy. And I also, at that point in my life, I had been, applying lots of places in DFW, didn't get a bite for about 3 months. So I was feeling kind of disheartened, and knowing that they were a small company, I assumed that they didn't really have the budget. But they followed through with it, and I got my first job in tech as pretty much a manual tester, amongst other things. When working for a super small company, you definitely wear a lot of hats, but it gave me the exposure and the experience that I was able to translate into, other job opportunities and kind of narrow down what I wanted to do. So I'm extremely, extremely, extremely grateful for that opportunity and for that experience. Currently, and as of May 4th, I have been an SDAT at TradeStation. So I currently have manual testing responsibilities that are developing into automated testing responsibilities. We are pretty much building the test suite from absolute bare bones nothing, which I'm used to at this point, because that's pretty much what happened at my last position. But this time I get money behind it. So I get to help choose what programs we're going to use for testing, what languages we're going to be testing in, a lot of autonomy, which is very freeing, very fun. So I'll go more into that in a little bit. So why is QA important? Besides making developers' jobs harder and making them, bite their nails when they push it through, be like, ah. No, that's not the main job. So probably from a business perspective, the more important reason, I guess, is keeping the stakeholders happy. There's always going to be a customer, there's always going to be a client. At the end of the day, it is a product that you are pushing through to a client. So providing transparency and insight into the development process, that's one of the main things that QA does, whether that means providing demos and video demonstrations to show the current standings of the product's features, whether it's web development or an app or something, and just making them aware and having them be comforted that we're right on track. Continuous evaluation. So QA testers, SDATs, they have to be experts on the product in order to be good at their job, especially when it comes to building what's called regression suites. That is the type of testing where you're thinking of every possible usage scenario. I'll use my company's app as an example, TradeStation's app. It's a crypto and stocks trading application. You need to think of every possible path that a user is going to take in order to, sell a stock or designate an option or, what have you. Because developers, it's extremely important job is to develop the feature with, that particular user in mind, sure. But testers are pretty much Wreck-It Ralph whenever it comes to these features, and that's why they are also really good at being involved in development in terms of planning and strategy, so that if a feature is brought up that doesn't necessarily align with the features of the past, they can bring that up and say, like, hey, we're going to experience some technical debt. If we bring this in, what about this thing? Isn't this exactly what this does? Why make something completely new if we could just revamp something older? Maybe shift things around. Yeah, there's that. And then obviously there's catching bugs. That's pretty much what QA is known for. But so there is the mindset of, why can't developers catch their own bugs? Which, yes, they do while they're writing them, before they make a push request. But that's not their main job. Like, their job is to write and develop code. But yeah, that's QA's main MO. They have to be extremely diligent and analytical, but also creative in how they go through the application or, the web page, whatever's being designed. So at a very high level, this is the testing lifecycle. And there's gonna be more descriptions of these things on the next slide. So requirement analysis, this seems pretty straightforward. This is sitting in with the stakeholders to figure out what is needed within this test in order to prove to you that this feature and this functionality works, basically. You would typically see this spelled out as a given when then statement, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Given the client is logged into the app, when they click on the person icon on the left-hand side, it brings them to their profile page. Like that's it. It's just to describe the behavior in which the feature or functionality is exhibiting. Test planning. I'll just scroll this down because I'm going to describe them anyway. Never mind, I'll talk about it. Okay, test planning. What do we want it to accomplish? What type of tests do we want to use? There are a whole bunch of different tests that are used for different purposes. There's end-to-end testing, which means from the second it's deployed to the very end of the process, which is your sprint retrospective. Like all of those different phases require like methodical step-by-step process. There is manual testing, automated testing. Not going to go through all of those with you just because time and also attention. But yeah, they all serve different purposes and they're all equally important. Test design. This goes into more, manual testing versus automated testing. How do you want, them to be executed? Test environment setup. This one is done at a build level. So for those who are iOS developers, you're very familiar with Xcode. And a lot of companies use the simulator as a way to do manual testing and automated testing. That would be one example of a test environment. There's also Test Flight, App Store Connect. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there. But basically, yes, an environment for which the user can test the beta or the initial build before it launches to production, the client can see it. Test execution. This is doing your due diligence, doing the testing. It's pretty straightforward. So basically with the test execution, the difference between that one and regression testing. So test execution, you're mainly testing the features that are involved in that sprint that you're focusing on developing. And then regression is like the entire suite of the entire product. typically those are automated because they're extremely tedious and they take a really, really long time. Either that or they don't happen typically because the sheer manpower that's needed to complete an entire suite's worth of either manual testing, you would need just a ton of people and a ton of time. So it's typically in a company's best interest to automate that. Test closure, basically just viewing the results of how the tests fared, whether they passed, failed. If they failed, was it because they were blocked by a certain feature? Just annotating what happened, basically. And then the last one, sprint retrospective, which is typically referred to in the Scrum methodology. So it's what went well, what didn't go well, what can we work on, what can we bring into next sprint to focus on in like a thing that is easily managed and we can work on just a little bit at a time. That's pretty much the life cycle. Is this all making sense so far, or is this a little much? You can feel free to unmute if you want. So far, so good? Cool. Okay. So one of the biggest arguments that I hear from employers, mostly employers that would rather see profit than invest in their team. It happens. Why have a QA team? Why have a QA team? Because obviously, like I've mentioned before, why can't developers find their own bugs and write unit tests line by line and in line with the code that they're developing? Which, yes, like some employers might ask you to do that. As far as like initial testing, but like at the end of the day, your job is to develop the feature, your job is to develop the bug fix and push that out. Like that's your one main thing, that's your skill set, and that's awesome. That should be it, in my opinion. Because it's kind of the difference between being an author, like being a writer, and being an editor. Like if you think about it like that, those are two totally different skill sets. Like there's someone that's really good at world building and creating the characters and using the language in a way that invokes a certain thing. And then there's an editor that goes line by line and makes sure that they adhering to guidelines, making sure that it matches the quality of the rest of the app, thinking abstractly about scenarios to, again, I'll bring Wreck-It Ralph back into this, to do the most that they possibly can to exacerbate and stress test the app. So that's not me. But in the situations that I've been with, my past couple of jobs, I've definitely been in a situation where I was the one person QA team. And then I've been in a situation where there's actually a QA team. And the difference between the success of the team as a whole, and when I mean the team as a whole, I mean, development, QA, Scrum Master, web services, pretty much just all together. We all succeed a lot more whenever we, adhere to those types of responsibilities and just continue communication as much as possible. So, misconceptions and anomalies. We already kind of touched on one of these, so I won't harp on it much. One, QA's job is just to make Dev's job harder. It's definitely true that leadership has made QA in the past feel that finding bugs is the only way to make their job redeemable. Like in order for them to do their job, they have to find bugs because that's a concrete metric. But that's not always going to happen. Like, you can't justify your job like that. That hits a very like us versus them mentality against developers, and that's not healthy. That doesn't help anything. So that's definitely more of a management issue versus, team specific. This attitude reflects leadership, Captain. QAs don't understand what the feature is supposed to do. If that's the truth, then you're in trouble. Like, again, going back to like that they need to be the expert on the product. Just as like a personal anecdote, one of the things that I feel has really helped me succeed in this particular role, I guess, is that I started off in customer service and I started off in retail. And there's technically there's a lot different, but really there's not, because you have to have compassion, you have to have the desire to consistently improve the product and to consistently improve the customer experience enough to want to technically change it and make an actual impact. So, and in order to write specific and accurate and efficient test cases, they need to be in those stakeholder meetings. They need to be in those development meetings. So if they don't know what the feature is supposed to do, that's definitely on them, and they are probably not in the right role. QAs don't know how to code, so they obviously couldn't comprehend what I go through. I've heard this one a couple times. So obviously there's different types of QA roles. There's manual tester, which, yeah, it's their job to not know how to code. Obviously, if they wanted someone who knew how to code, they'd get an SDET or a software engineer, or repurpose a developer, which I've definitely seen that in the past. And then there's QA analysts. Again, it's not necessarily their job to code, but it definitely improves their job in their experience if they do. It just depends on the requirements of the stakeholder, to be honest. Because if they require automated tests and if they require like code-based proof and evidence of the feature working, then yeah, they need to know how to code. But boiling it down, to the actual root of the issue, which I'm sure you can see just by looking at the statement, it all comes down to communication. So, in your daily Scrum, being transparent and making sure that you have the requirements down of that particular feature of that ticket. And even if, you feel a little bit like an idiot asking for like the millionth time, hey, what is this supposed to do? I completely forgot. Yeah, just being transparent and being on the same page. So you can work on that. QA and dev, how to improve relationships between the two departments. I see that I'm kind of running short on time, so I'm gonna wrap it up a little bit, or at least like shorten it. So pair programming, this is a term in practice that has been seen pretty frequently throughout the XP community, extreme programming. So if you're interested in that, you can Google that. That's a kind of a topic in and of itself. But pair programming is essentially you, whether you're a developer or QA or whomever, either hopping on a call or working side by side to develop whatever it is you're trying to develop. So in the traditional sense of pair programming, that could mean the iOS engineer and the Android engineer hopping on a call and programming together for like an hour and a half. And one of them shares their screen and they can go line by line to make sure that whatever they're developing is in tandem. And you can definitely do this, QA plus the developer in question. As they're writing the feature, you can write the requirements and the code, if necessary, for that particular feature on that same call, so you can get that done at the same time. That's something that has been pretty helpful in my experience. Retrospective meetings, for anyone who has experienced the Scrum methodology in the past, you're very familiar with this. Basically saying highs and lows, what went really well, what went poorly, how can we work on that, and just engaging in transparency and learning how to give critical feedback and taking critical feedback. Those are two extremely necessary skills for growth in any situation. So finding the way to deliver your criticism tactfully and professionally, definitely something that your team members, if they are mature and professional as well, they will understand, they will accept as well, and respect you more for. That kind of slipped into that last one, so I'll go ahead. So pretty much last, job roles and salaries. Quality assurance engineer, 78,000. These were salaries that I grabbed from Glassdoor for the DFW area for this year. Automated software engineer, 88K. This one, it really depends on the industry. For tech specific or fintech or medical, this number is actually a bit higher. It ends up being 92 to 120. So it is pretty competitive. It really depends on the languages and frameworks that you use. So that one's a little bit more fluid. Quality assurance specialists. This one is not specific to tech. This one, actually I have personal experience with my dad's quality assurance with basically aerospace companies. And that's probably one of the more stable numbers and salary expectations that I've seen probably within the past 20 years. And then SDET, this one is also pretty fluid depending on frameworks, languages, and industry, but across industries, 92 to 96 is a pretty common expectation. And then quality engineer, again, not super industry specific, but that is pretty accurate from what I've seen so far. Common paths to QA. I was just thinking about this a little bit earlier. So a lot of developers who are really excellent at testing their code tend to find joy in that, tend to find joy in seeing like tick, success, pass, 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 and it's very, manageable and scalable, seeing those finite items of success. At least that's what I've heard from developers. Customer success, for the reasons that I've mentioned earlier, having a passion for the product in mind and for the customer experience in mind tend to gravitate towards QA. And of course, manual testing. That's the typical natural progression, is moving into more technical aspects. After QA, if they decide not to stay and develop within quality, they tend to be more project managers or product owners within an organization, just because they start climbing the ladder of like, how can I further impact the product? How can I, really take ownership of whatever I'm working on? So, okay, read this slide already. Yay! Thank you so much for letting me steal your attention. I'll definitely allow any questions. And here's a picture of my dogs for tax.
So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. We have one from Cindy. She asks, can you provide examples of automated testing and when to use it versus manual, and recommendations of good automated testing tools?
Awesome. Okay, so it really depends on what you're trying to test, because in terms of web testing, Cypress is typically what I've had a little bit of experience with with that one. It's typically written with JavaScript. There's WebDriver IO and Selenium for Java-based testing. And then Selenium WebDriver also has a multitude of different languages that you can run tests in. There's C++, there's Swift, Python. In terms of when to do it, so it's really helpful for smoke testing, which smoke testing is basically going through an environment and just making sure that everything was deployed correctly. It's pretty much just to make sure, okay, this is a stable testing environment. It's not necessarily to go through and break it like regression testing. More so to say like, okay, all of the features that were supposed to be deployed were deployed. Cool. And then also regression testing for what I mentioned earlier, which is, it's extremely tedious. We're talking libraries of 10,000 plus tests that would otherwise would have had to be performed manually. Libraries that are built incrementally along the development of those features within the development of the product. Typically, the timing for regression testing is once a release. So it depends on how frequently the team pushes out releases to the website or the app. Some teams do once a week, which is insane. And you typically have to have a lot of manpower and coordination for that. But typically 2 weeks or a month, but definitely the advised practice is to do it within any major feature changes, for sure. Just to make sure that with the introduction of that new feature, you didn't screw around and greatly impact the other aspects of the app. I think, did that answer all of those questions? There was a couple.
It looks like it. The other question we have in the chat is, what's the difference between automated software tester and SDET? And in parentheses, after automated software tester, they put same as automated engineer with a question mark.
Yeah, that's a good one, because typically they can be pretty synonymous. It just depends on the responsibilities that they are requiring of the SDET or automated tester. But typically, what I found is like automated tester tends to be like an individual contributor role. And they tend to have more segmented teams where like this is the QA team and this is the dev team. It's not like you're all working like together. It's typically harder to find automated testing and traditional dev teams that pair program and work alongside each other. And I have found a lot of automated tester positions that are contract and are just used for a very specific amount of time to pass a type of like really important quality inspection, like for the US government or something, or for IBM or something. But yeah, typically an SDET can be a very fluid role. It's like putting a posting up for a software engineer. Like, okay, is it web-based? Is it app-based? Like you definitely would have to inquire a little bit more. But yeah, automated tester would definitely just focus on automated tests. They would not be doing any manual testing. SDET has kind of a fluid role where they initially will build out a manual suite and then move on to automated. from there, yeah, that's pretty much it.
I'm going to jump in on that one too, since that is directly in my job experience. I worked for Microsoft for 16 years in test automation specifically, and pretty much everything Megan said is correct, depending on the company that you're going to be working for. However, an automation engineer is more focused on running the tests, where an SDET is focused on writing the tests. And so those roles definitely have a lot of overlap in some companies. At Microsoft, when I was there, they were very distinct. Like the SDET was very focused on writing code, writing tests, and then the automation team would take those tests, plug them into the test automation framework, and run all the tests and stuff like that. So they can have a lot of overlap. They can also be very distinct depending on where you're working.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks for adding that. And any other questions?
Another one we have in the chat is, I'm pivoting into tech, aiming for QA base on transferable skills, worked in media research. Do you have any advice on how to go for manual tester roles with not as many relevant hard skills?
Yeah. It's someone that definitely did not have the traditional path into manual testing. I would say try and leverage what you have, because anybody can, do a boot camp, or anybody can, pay for a course that'll teach them the, skills that they'll need on the job. And a lot of jobs will coach you up once you're there, but there's a lot of value to taking what you already have and kind of spinning it in a way that you find advantageous for testing. So media research, that's huge. Like, did you say media research? Is that right? Well, research in general is a very tedious task, and it takes a lot of diligence. It's a lot of documentation, which is like 80% of the job. Like if you don't like writing, or if it's not one of your skill sets, that might be something that you want to spend more time to develop. But if that's something that comes natural to you, or you have experience in, definitely leverage that. In terms of, if there's one thing that I could have done to kind of, change my chances, back if the GED thing didn't happen, I would say learning how to write a very basic test case, and just going through something that you know really, really well, whether it's like, your Gmail account, or I don't know, Facebook or something, and writing out just a whole bunch of test cases to show them, be like, hey, I may not have done manual testing before, but like, here's what I have. It's a version 1 because I'm still learning, but I have the basic like skill sets down where I can say like, this is what the functionality is supposed to do. Here is like, a given when then statement of given the client is logged in, when they click on the Facebook button in the top left-hand corner, then they are brought to their home page, and stuff like that. If that's something that you definitely want to start applying to within the next couple of months, if you haven't already, then I would definitely say start working on that, start building projects for yourself and like putting them in GitHub. That's something that I probably would have advised myself of like in the past if I'd had the chance. And it sounds really funny, but GitHub is not just for code. Like 90% of it's used for code, obviously, but you can put just text documents in there. And that definitely can be used to your advantage in terms of sharing that with a prospective employer. I hope that helps.
All right, we got another one. Says that they caught the comment about leveraging research experience or leveraging research experience. And that's what they do in research and development. And can you expound on that? Is it a really desirable skill? And they're just trying to figure out how to market themselves to get into tech.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of like, you know, breaking into tech, it's such, obviously my path was like, here you go, you're in tech now, you know, in terms of the manual testing role, but definitely research and development is, there's a lot of similarities there, again, with documentation and adhering to particular guidelines. When you're researching a particular topic, yeah, I think what I mentioned previously, just like building documentation for yourself and showing that you can, you know, document information effectively and organize them effectively. That would be just a great start in terms of building projects for yourself that you can display to employers. I would really, really love to see your resume at some point, just so that I can kind of, you know, talk you through the different experience that you have, so that, you know, I can talk through what you could leverage in particular, whether that be the industry that you're in. If you really love that industry, okay, maybe start there, and, you know, working along that same vein. But yeah, if it's not too much trouble, I would love to see your resume at some point. Any other questions?
Okay, we have one that says, what training do you recommend a junior tester who has to be S8 automated engineer and manual tester role at the same time for an organization that is still practicing waterfall methodology?
Gotcha. Okay. So just to clarify, to teach themselves automated testing? Could you repeat that? I think I might have.
Yeah, I'll repeat it. It says, what training do you recommend junior testers who has to be an SSET automated engineer and manual tester role at the same time for an organization that is still practicing waterfall methodology?
Gotcha.
I assume that means to teach themselves.
Yeah, it sounds like it. If you have the type of company where they will reimburse you for your courses, I would highly suggest Udemy courses, in which case I can definitely share some. There are a couple Cypress courses that I found really helpful. Typically, you would want to like learn some of the language first. So step one, if you're learning automated testing, figure out what language the product is written in, whether it's, you know, Swift, Python, JavaScript, with Java, what have you, just so that you can be as native as possible. That's typically best practices, just because, you know, stuff happens, people quit, you know, test suites aren't finished. And then they bring in someone new, and, you know, they don't know Python or they don't know Swift. So typically, you know, mixing languages just makes things kind of harder. So if you can learn the language that the app or website is native to, then that would definitely be advantageous. So again, yeah, it depends on whether it's web-based or app-based, but I would just say set yourself kind of incremental goals for what you want to accomplish. be very specific about what you want those test cases to do and make it super simple. Like, you know, have this one launch the app, and then you can start your research on like, you know, how to launch app in Xcode in Swift. And, you know, just starting just super basic stuff. You know, and then eventually that's going to turn into, okay, launch app, you know, in Swift, and then navigate to this page, and then navigate to this page. And you start building in kind of an arsenal, step by step, but be very clear to, you know, your manager or to whomever that you're reporting to about this, about expectations, because it is a very slow process to teach yourself if you don't have anyone to kind of guide you. Yeah, just small manageable goals. And yeah, just I would say just focus on that. And focus on parts of either the app or the website that are pretty stagnant that aren't, you know, pushing out new features all the time, so that you don't have to go back and update them, you know, a lot. But yeah, just keep that in mind. I hope that's helpful. But I would definitely say, yeah, Udemy courses as much as possible, Code Academy, learning the language to a certain point. I'm not saying like you need to be an expert developer. You don't, but you just need to know enough to execute a test script, which kind of takes a lot of the pressure off. But, you know, taking Udemy courses that are project based so that you can start kind of putting the pieces together in your mind of like what commands do what, and then, you know, you can start building a library in your head of, you know, all the terms and conditions and functions and such. Yeah. Also, separate test suites, one for manual, one for automated. Keep them separate, please. I've definitely done that. Don't do what I did. Any other questions?
I don't see any more in the chat. Please do feel free to unmute to ask any if you want. I think I forgot to say that at the start.
Okay.
Well, thank you. That was great, Megan.
It got a little bit easier at the end there. Like once I started getting into a flow, I started losing breath in the first 30 seconds for sure. But no, it was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Megan.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you. And we're all in Slack, so if you have any questions, feel free to jump in there and ask any.